Hello everybody, my name is Darwin and today we're going to see how to consume a REST web service. For today's example, we will use a web service that will allow us to identify plants and flowers based on photos. We will cover how to send files to the web service, how to asynchronously call the web service, and how to analyze the returned JSON file. So without further ado, let's go. Alright, so I'm in WINDEV now and I have prepared this project as a support for our webinar. So this project is aimed at generating an executable for Windows, but the same methodology applies if you want to create a mobile application or a website. So the service I'm going to use comes from the plantnet.org website. Here it is. This web service does is that it allows me to identify plants or flowers based on photos. So now we're in the home page of plantnet.org. What we'll do is that we'll go to resources, then we'll select developers and then API. So now that we are on this page, you can see that I have already signed in. You can create an account very easily, and once you're in and you're taken to this website, quick note here, you can see that you have up to 500 identification requests per day at no cost, which is very handy. Of course, comes in very handy, and it's more than enough for our webinar. So what we'll do is that we'll go to my account in the upper left corner, and here I can see my API key. This is the one that I'm going to use to call the web service, right? Next, let's go to doc, and here I find the different steps that I need to follow in order to call the web service. So there are two ways to call the web service, right? I'm sorry, there are two ways to identify the plants. And those are based on the HTTP GET and HTTP POST methods, as indicated here, right? So with GET, what I will do is that I will pass URLs of images that contains the plants that I want to identify, right? And the POST method uses, I'm going to pass image files of flowers and plants that are located on my computer. So as a quick reminder, with GET, you retrieve information, you fetch information, and with POST, you update or publish information. So what we'll do is that we will take a look at GET first. So we'll click on that method, and as we can see in the explanation, we have the URL of the service we're going to call, right? We also have the URLs of the images. You can see them right here. You can pass up to 5 URLs of images in a single call. However, they have to be actually URLs and images of the same plant, same species, all right? And right here you see that it says encoded URLs, right? And what this does is that it transforms certain characters like colon and slash, and it encodes them so that there's a clear distinction between the URLs of the web service and the URLs of the images. So now that they are encoded, there is a number of parameters that are passed to in the identification requests. So the first of those parameters is the API key. Here it is. Then we see the URLs of the images that have been encoded, right? And then we see the part of what they call the organ of the flower that is being, depicted in the photo. So it could be a flower or a leaf or any other. So this is what the identification service URL looks like. And lastly, we get the result. We can see that this is in JSON format and it contains some arrays. We can say that because of the square brackets, right? But as is, what we'll do is that we'll try to deserialize this JSON and try to get information in a readable format later on. Okay, but we'll see that in a second. Okay, so we're back at WINDEV, and what we'll do is that I will select my first button, search by image URL. I'm going to press F2 and I'm going to see the code. So I have prepared this code for the button, and let us go step by step to see what we did here. So the first thing is that I declared a REST request and a REST response variable that will allow me to make the call to call the web service. I also declared a string to store the API key, as you can see right here. Then I used the URL property of query search, or my REST request variable, to specify the URL that I'm going to call. All right. Next, I created an internal procedure. I named it add parameters. And what I did was using the question mark for the first parameter, right, to indicate the first parameter, and using the ampersand character to separate the other parameters. Once I have defined that with my internal procedure, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to add each parameter. So the first one is going to be the API key, right? The next parameter, and this is something we didn't mention before, but we can specify the language that we want for the response. We can specify that. So what I did was that I chose English. I then passed the URL, right? So this is an image that I found on the internet. So I got the URL and I pasted it directly. However, let's keep in mind that we saw before that this URLs would have to be encoded. So to do so, I used the URL encode function right here, and I specified the encode URL parameter at the end. So by using these two, I'm making sure that my URL will be encoded and that there will be no characters creating conflicts or confusion between the URL of these images and the URL of the web service, right? So lastly, I added one last parameter to indicate that what I'm looking for is a flower. There we go. So here's an optional parameter, and I say optional because I specify the method I'm going to use is HTTP GET, and HTTP GET is what I use by default. If I don't specify anything, HTTP GET will be used. However, as we are seeing two different methods, it's a good idea to set that clear right now that we're using HTTP GET. Later on, we'll see how to use HTTP POST. All right, but well, this is the method we're using for this part. Then I use the send function, right, which is the one that will call the web service, right? And I will use a variable of type REST response, which is query response over here, to store the result of the call. Okay, so the web service will return a status code. For those who know, 200 means that everything went as expected, no problem. The request was successful. And what I will do is that I'm going to use a very simple trace window. First, to confirm that I got the result in my response in the content I was expecting. So in this case, it should be a JSON file, and I will display that content using the same trace window. Okay, so once I'm here, I'm going to press F9 to run the test of our application. And what we can see here is our little two buttons. I am going to click on the first one, and we get the result. So first of all, I see that I got a JSON content basically, and as an additional bit of information, I see that it was encoded using UTF-8. So here is the content of the JSON file, and well, as is, we cannot really, make a response in a readable format for most humans. So we will try to deserialize this JSON content later on, right? But before we do, before we cover how to deserialize the JSON content, let's talk about the send function, right? So let me close this. In our case, it is executed synchronously. What this means is that the application will give control back to the user only after the web service has responded or after a certain timeout has been reached. And here there is no problem really because the web service responds immediately. However, this is not always the case. So what we should do here is calling the function, calling the web service asynchronously to avoid blocking the user, right? And display the result once the application receives it. So this is very easy to do actually. What we have to do is to pass a callback to the send function, right? So we're going to call it process result, let's say, right? And I will remove this assignment right here. Very good. And I will create an internal procedure, right? That I'm going to name process result. And I will pass as a parameter the query response variable. There we go. Now I'm going to move this if part of my code here. Very good. And I will get rid of this declaration up here since I no longer need it. Very good. Okay. So now we have our code in asynchronous mode, right? Now there is an important aspect to this callback. If the call to the web service is performed in the main thread, which is the case here, the callback will be called from the main thread as well. Likewise, if the call to the web service is performed in a secondary thread, so will be the callback, right? So in the second case, if we are in a secondary thread, we need to make sure that we don't modify or access the interface, right, in our code, since this can create errors. So here we are using we're calling the web service from the main thread, and we're using the trace function. There is no problem where we'll display something, but we're doing it from the main thread. So if you're on a secondary thread, please make sure you don't access or modify the interface. Okay, with that out of the way, now let's see how to deserialize the JSON file. So here I'm going to declare a variable of type JSON. I'm going to call it buff.json. Of course, I declare that it is a variable of type JSON, and I'm going to assign query result that content. There we go. Now let's take sorry, this is query response actually. Good. Query response. Now let's take a look back at the documentation, right, and where we can see the type of result that is expected. We see that it is a JSON file, and what we want to get to is actually common names, which is over here, right? This array, we know it's an array because of the square brackets. It is a sub-entry of the species array, which in turn comes from the results array. Okay, so let's go back to our code, right? So we're going to loop through these arrays to get to the content we need. So what we're going to do is using a for each loop. So for each entry, let's say of JSON that results. There we go. And within this for each loop, I'm going to use another for each loop. And this time around, I'm going to use name. That's what I want to get. Of entry dot species. Oh, sorry. That common names. And instead of getting the type of content and what we use for the first trace window, here we know that we're getting a JSON file. Now there's no point in using this anymore. So we are going to remove this part, right? And I'm going to take this this line, this trace over here, and I'm going to put it right here. Now we no longer need all of this syntax. What we need to display, we want to see, is the name, plain and simple. So let's get rid of spaces here. Very good. Now we can test the code. So I'll press F9. There we go. So I'll press search image by URL. And as you can see, now we got the common names in a readable format in our trace window. So for this webinar, we are simply showing the names of the plant via a trace window. However, if you need to store the results to handle them later on, I recommend using the WLanguage deserialize function to transfer the content of the JSON file to WLanguage structures that you might have declared beforehand. Actually, to declare these structures, you can use an online converter that has been developed by one of our engineers. And now this tool is completely free to use. And what it will do is, let me show you. I will go to step number 6, where we get the JSON content. I can copy that content. I come to the converter. It is free online tool, and I will simply copy the JSON content. I will automatically get all the WLanguage structures I need to work in WLanguage, just like that. So it is a very, very practical tool, and you will find the link to that tool in the video description. Okay, so let's move on to the second method, right? Which uses the post HTTP method. And what we'll do is that instead of passing URLs, we will pass images that are located on my computer. Okay, so let's scroll down a little bit. If we expand to JavaScript example, and even if we're not very familiar with JavaScript, we see that the parameters we have specified before are passed here using a form. So that's what we're going to do using WLanguage. We're going to create a form. So let me go back to WINDEV. And what I will do is that I'm going to delete these 2 lines over here. I won't pass the URL, and I won't pass the organ or the part of the plant I'm looking for, because now I'm going to use a form to pass those parameters. So I'll get rid of these 2 lines of code. And this time around, I'm not going to use the get method. Of course, this time around, we will use HTTP post. There we go. So now I'm going to create a form using HTTP create form. And I will use the name form, just like that, in uppercase. Next, I will add parameters using HTTP add parameter. Very good. So the name of my form is form, right? And the parameter I'm going to pass is organs, right? And the value of the parameter I'm going to pass is flower. I'm going to specify that I'm looking for a flower, right? Very good. Now I'm going to add the file using the function http add file, right? Once again, the name of our form is form. The parameter name is going to be images, right? The file name, well, I'm actually going to build this file name myself. So what I will do is I will call complete dir. There we go. frep dir x. Very good. And I will add the name of the file that I know is in the X folder, and it is called passionflower.jpg. Very good. Now, since I need to send this form to the web service, I will no longer use the send function, but I'm going to use http send form. And I have these 3 syntax suggestions. Out of the 3, I'm going to choose the third one. Very good. So I have form. Then the HTTP request is going to be query search. And the language procedure or callback that I'm going to use is process result. Excellent. So I'll delete this line. I'm no longer using the send function. And we can now run our code. Let's go. So I click on the second button, search by local image, and what I get is the common names of the flower I was looking for in a perfectly readable format. And that's how you consume a REST web service in WLanguage. So as you can see, it's very easy. You get the results in a readable format. You make little adjustments in your code, and you can go from synchronous to asynchronous processes just like that. So I hope you guys have found this webinar useful. If you did, please don't hesitate to contact us at info@windev.com, right? And if you want more videos like this, don't hesitate to hit that like button, to share with other developers, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So thank you very much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.